autism has been in the news again for a couple of different reasons. I think we all know that there's been like a false association between vaccines and autism. There's a famous paper that, so many authors ended up retracting their names. But I think this conversation comes up a lot. There's a lot of conversation around vaccines right now because America's going through a lot of internal strife and discussion around that.
Also, it was like a month ago when I always say RFK, but it's RFK Jr. came forward to talk and really like highlight a specific study that found that 1 in 150 kids in the year 2000 had autism, whereas now it's up to 1 in 31 kids. The CDC has another new report saying that there's been a 15% jump in autism cases in the last 2 years. And these trends are occurring throughout a lot of high-income countries like the UK, Denmark, South Korea, and Japan. And so there are people like RFK Jr. who have truly sat and said, there is an environmental toxin causing this. And by the end of the year, we're going to know exactly why. There's so much, like, we're going to explain to you the cause of this increase in autism, which has caused science researchers across the world to panic and really talk about what we're going to talk about today, because it's important people understand as we go forward, because it is going to get co-opted, I think, to change science and do some messed up things.
Yeah, and the one other thing I want to say that we'll bring up today and talk about is the research between Tylenol or acetaminophen and autism and even ADHD and things like this. This has been in the news a lot. I think RFK Jr. has talked about this and that they believe they should like restrict the use of Tylenol, especially for people who are pregnant. That's kind of what the science or the conversation has been around. So we're going to dive into like all this mix of stuff.
So the first thing is like, what is autism? Which I kind of was like doing all this research and then forgot to kind of be like, wait, because they just talk about ASD, autism,
right,
or like autism, like spectrum disorder. And I always was, and then eventually was like, what is it? Mm-hmm. So it's actually so vague in some ways because it can show up so differently for so many different people now. Mm-hmm. And that generally it's a harder time communicating, specific intense interests, or a harder time with like when your routine's disrupted, intense reactions to bright lights, loud noises, and stimuli that might be deemed annoying. I was like, okay. Mm-hmm. Like, it was like, I feel like sometimes you need to be reminded of that because it feels like...
It's nice to have also like definitional boundaries to, especially when you're researching something, to say, okay, does it fit and tick these boxes? We can't just have a vague amorphous, like, of course it's called a spectrum. And if through the past we have had words like Asperger's, and now people talk about being neurodivergent, but some people say that they're like completely functional in society and can hold a job and do these things. But of course there's other ends of the spectrum where people need full assistance and need help from other people. And so there is a spectrum, and obviously we and scientists and everyone wants to respect that someone can have some of these traits, but I think it is useful to have like these definitions that help to especially look at research and say, does this person have this condition?
Yes. And so we're going to start talking about the reasons that scientists and researchers agree on could cause someone to have autism. And the most striking, the most obvious, and the answer as to why someone would most likely have autism, which RFK Jr. and a lot of like mega people are ignoring, is genetics. Mm-hmm. So that is the most important thing to remember. It's 70 to 90% inherited. It's similar to the inheritability of height, which I thought was really interesting, which is 80% heritability. Yeah. So like if you look at a family, if you have a family history of someone having ASD, you're much more likely to have it. Yeah. If one sibling has it, it's more likely the other sibling's going to have it. When they looked at identical twins, it's extremely likely for them both to have it. So it's genetic. Like that. I just
or
can't
at least a massive piece of it is from studies shows that like perhaps there are environmental things that can affect, and that's why we'll talk about like Tylenol, can that increase the odds or something?
Or pollution.
Like plastics, these kind of things that people talk about. Or vaccines, which has always been controversial. It's not true. But just to say, it doesn't mean there can't be environmental factors, but when the research looks into twins and siblings and these things, it's like, okay, we can see that a chunk of it is heritable. It's being passed on from
Yes.
the family genes.
And what's interesting about these studies is that they can't understand, like the human brain is so complicated, they can't understand exactly what's going on genetically to cause the autism. They just look overall at, like, picture like a family tree, and then they see the heritability. They're not at the point now with science to go, this is the specific gene that causes this, that causes that. Like, it's so complicated. And I think one of the most important things to remember about this, and as if you're an American, as your government co-ops this to do crazy shit, is that this is so complicated. There's not going to be one thing by the end of the year that they figure out causes autism.
Yeah.
Like, that is what the point of this genetic research even is that they're like, the enemy of understanding this is the complexity of the brain, genetics, environment, and autism all coming together. There's not going to be one thing. And it disgusts me to think that was even said, that we're going to figure out the one thing.
It's like, not to get into like the politics of it, but it makes you realize, like, this is how, and I'm not saying this is like a left or right issue, but in terms of like an authoritarian government being able to say, we are the ones who can figure it out, can solve it. It comes down to a specific issue. We're going to find that one thing. Like, life is so much more complicated than that. It's like saying there's one thing that can cause cancer and we're just going to figure out cancer. It's like, no, when you start researching, you realize actually cells can metastasize in like so many different pathways. And that's why cancer is like very complicated to like eradicate, because it might be because your cells duplicate too fast. It might be because their apoptosis or cell death mechanisms are not functioning properly. There's like literally 10 different ways it can happen. And so I think autism is like especially when it comes to like a personality, not that this is like a personality disorder, but something that's like psychological in a way. We know these things are so much harder to quantify and take a lot more research and time and data, especially if we're saying parts of it might be environmental, parts of it might be genetic. It's just important to remember when someone promises they can be the ones to figure it out and they can force science to figure something out in a year that has been being studied for a long time. It's just like, take note of that.
Absolute horrifying red flag. Like, it's not like a partisan thing. It's extremely scary to think before doing any science, say you're going to figure it out is crazy. We'll get more into that, I think, at the end. We can keep going now, I think, through all the different examples of specific things that could cause autism, which might get co-opted by like the media. So maybe you could talk about Tylenol.
Yeah, sure.
Because it is so interesting.
Okay, so something I find interesting, and obviously I'm going to use the word Tylenol and acetaminophen. Obviously, acetaminophen is like the generic name for the brand Tylenol. This is the drug that's in it, but you can go to your drugstore and just get acetaminophen and have that same effect as Tylenol. What I find interesting is that the way that it's being talked about by this like MAHA movement, like RFK Jr., is they're always talking about Tylenol. But it's like, that's not the drug. And it's obviously so that people feel afraid of it, in my mind. Like, sure, you might argue like
big pharma vibes?
Well, I just feel like, why aren't they talking about it as acetaminophen? That's the drug. If they believe that, it just feels interesting that they're like posing it as Tylenol. We're going to take down Tylenol. Anyway, going into the research on this, why it has popped up and scared people is because for a long time, doctors would say, okay, Advil, which is ibuprofen, maybe isn't the best to take if you're pregnant because it can impact the blood flow to the fetus. And Tylenol has always been considered, or acetaminophen's been considered sort of like the more safe one. If you have a fever or you're not feeling like you have aches or something's going on, you can take that. But there's been this sort of like slow history of studies popping up, things showing like, maybe there's some evidence that Tylenol acts as like an endocrine disruptor, maybe, which is something similar to like plastics, like phthalates are an endocrine disruptor. And I think it's like structurally acetaminophen acts like this in your body. So there's been some concerns around that, studies that have flagged that. But again, it's always been like some studies show it, some studies don't. There's never been overwhelming evidence for this. Then again, from that, some studies started finding correlations between autism and people who are pregnant who take Tylenol, and kind of in proportion to like how much they would take Tylenol. And it all came to a head in 2021 when Nature Journal, an extremely respected and highly reputable journal, posted sort of this thing called a consensus statement where they were like, we believe people should stop taking Tylenol if they're pregnant. There is some evidence out there for this. And so don't risk it because we're seeing these weird correlations with autism. Now, that's like not problematic in and of itself, but many scientists came out and said like the evidence feels so weak for this. Maybe there's associations, but like there's not enough out there.
And there's not actually a consensus. And so the word consensus statement is it's like an interesting sort of like literary issue because it's actually not a consensus.
That makes you think that every scientist out there is agreeing, or the vast majority. And in fact, the vast majority were not agreeing. Of course, like more reasonable scientists and those who would have published this are reasonable as well. If you're going in Nature, it's like they're seeing that some studies are showing
it's
these
worth
associations.
Educating the public.
They're not saying like the people who are criticizing this aren't saying there's no evidence for this. They're just saying to make it a consensus statement is maybe a little bit rushed. So there's been subsequent research and meta-analyses from this. The interesting thing is that some meta-analyses were finding the same thing, like 20 to 30%. This was like the number of the chance higher that your child would have autism if you were taking Tylenol.
Acetaminophen.
Yes, acetaminophen. Sorry, thank you. And so basically these other big reviews started playing together. They found the same result. And they were like, okay, well, first, that's a good thing because we're matching up with a similar number to what other studies are finding. But then they did something interesting, which not a lot of studies do because it's more complicated. They started, I mean, every study should probably do this. They started accounting for more variables. So they started looking at like, okay, well, what if we account more specifically for the pregnant person's age? What if we start accounting more for their health issues? What if we start accounting for X, Y, and Z? And the first one, when they just started accounting for their age, oh my gosh, our Google just started talking.
That's, the world's ending.
You can't hear it, but sometimes our little Google Home thing just starts talking to us, and it scares me.
Accounting for age. Okay, we can talk about age because I have lots on that too.
Yeah. So accounting for age alone brought the rates of autism down to 5%. So from 30% at the high end to 5%.
When you take acetaminophen.
Yeah. So people taking acetaminophen, we're like, okay, we see 30% higher chance of autism. But if we start to realize and factor in age, the older somebody is, the more likely they are to have a child with autism.
Yes. So there's other studies, and it's like if the mother having the kid is over 40, there's a 3.2 to 5.6% increased chance of that kid having autism. And similar, a little bit smaller for when the father or the person with the penis's sperm is over 40. So, okay, that is a trend that they have seen. Is okay, like that has been increasing recently. People are having kids later. Older men are actually having like more kids with their like older sperm. So okay, that could be a factor. And when you start bringing that factor into this Tylenol research, it starts to decrease what actually the acetaminophen's doing.
Right. And I mean, in epidemiology, you call this like a confounding variable, right? So, or this starts to look like maybe the Tylenol or acetaminophen is not the main factor, but it's associated with somebody's age.
Yeah.
Same with like, oh, we're noticing all these. The example our university professor used to always give when we were first learning about confounding variables was like, for some reason, all these people who carry around lighters in their pockets have lung cancer.
Yeah.
And so do the lighters cause lung cancer? Obviously, we can all know, okay, no, it's the cigarettes.
Yeah.
But the lighter is a confounding variable because it's associated, but it's not actually the part that's causing
like
it.
someone might be like, it's the metal in the lighter in your leg.
Yeah, exactly. But it's easier to see that clear kind of like, obviously, we're not thinking it's the lighter, but there's an association.
Yeah.
So these studies then further started analyzing other variables, genes being a big one. So like you said, or Greg had mentioned, 70 to 90% of autism is believed to be genetic. These studies started looking at family units. So they would, the best kind of family unit study is on twins. But if you can't do that, sort of the second best is like look at siblings. Let's look at families where maybe they had like a database, I think, of 2.5 million kids here over the course of, I think, 26 years. This was a study from Sweden who like tracks a lot of their health data regardless. So basically it's like, let's track what drugs the mother was taking, their health. If they were taking acetaminophen, maybe they took it for one kid but didn't for the other. And then when they start looking at these genetic variables, they realize the acetaminophen claims flatline. It's no longer accounting for the rates of autism,
especially in the high rates that will be touted from that consensus statement, etc. Also, there's a strong, I shouldn't use those words, but there is a link between infections during pregnancy and your child having autism. So that's another confounding variable. If you are a mother who has an infection, you're going to more likely take Tylenol, but it's actually the infection that is increasing the amount of autism in your kid, not the Tylenol or the acetaminophen.
Now, like, of course, and we're not like the scientists. This is the scientific process. There are studies that still find these links, right? It doesn't mean that there's 0% impact. We're just seeing with these bigger studies, okay, it's probably not like 30%. If we're
it's not explaining the drastic rise in autism in recent years, which is the thing that I think no matter what, we can't get around. Yes. Yeah. And also trying to blame it on acetaminophen is the part that is actually crazy. To that drastic increase onto acetaminophen, some people are trying to say it's just that. And then that's where you're like, okay, that is completely false.
One other interesting confounding variable. It's like, as we said, genetic. If you have an autistic child, you're more likely to be on the spectrum. It doesn't mean you are necessarily, but you're more likely. And moms or pregnant people on the spectrum experience more pain during pregnancy, including more migraines and stuff. So there's all these possibilities. Again, this doesn't mean, like, studies need to keep looking into this, but if someone's more likely to experience pain, maybe they're more likely to take painkillers. And so to wrap up like this acetaminophen part, of course, the research will grow and science is not infallible. And yes, pieces come in and out and more attention will be given to this. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Like, if this current American administration does fund more research that's legitimate and isn't like biased.
Which it's not.
Yeah, we know that they want an answer. Doesn't mean every study that comes out that says there is a link is bad. It doesn't mean everyone that comes out that says there's no link is good. But the more studies, the more analysis we can do. And of course, we're not like medical providers or doctors, but the general consensus now from these more recent studies is like, if you're overly concerned and you're pregnant, of course you can try and avoid. There's other risks. If you do get sick and have a fever, for example, like that can also be really bad for a child. And so it's like, it may be better to look after that fever instead of letting your body have that. But it's more like, okay, if you're going to take Tylenol for weeks on end or Advil for weeks on end, you might be playing a riskier game. So of course, if you have it once in a while, your doctor probably would say, hey, if you just have like, or feeling a fever for a couple days.
Talk to your doctor, folks. Do not use TikTok.
Yeah.
Also, it's unbelievable how hard it is to find any like, I was like, okay, but like, I'll look into autism and vaccines. Literally nothing. It's not even part of the conversation. It's quite horrifying to think about how much it's been co-opted online. People, even in our video, there's no correlation between vaccines and autism.
Yeah.
Like, I'm just like, I'm saying, I'm going to start talking now about how there is a correlation between pollution and autism. Like, I'm about to talk about studies that there are some things that are not explaining the drastic increase, but they're kind of like, oh, like, there's something here. Even the acetaminophen, there is something there. The vaccine thing, it's like, there's actually nothing, which is so frustrating because it is probably the most popular concept online, is that vaccines
so pervasive.
Yes. And it's just like kind of scary when I'm like, there's no scientific evidence at all.
And I mean, like, I can
so
feel
weird.
Like, of course, I want to be empathetic to like new parents and people who go through traumatic experiences. And the thing is, like, vaccines that protect and save kids' lives are given when they're young. And so
exactly,
you can see
that's the
why
reason
a parent who might have a developing child and feel like their behavior isn't keeping track with others gets vaccinated, and that they're building this own correlation in their mind.
That's a big part of it, is that when people study why someone might think it was the vaccine, it's because when people are diagnosed with autism, they're usually around the same ages when they get childhood vaccines. It's that simple. It's like just like, oh God, it's just like an annoying coincidence.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously, even with vaccines in general, like, even if you get your flu vaccine, like, you might have aches and pains after that. Like, some people do have reactions to them. Obviously, on the whole, vaccines have been studied for hundreds of years and are constantly pushed for safety regulations because they're like a really intense thing to put into healthy people and healthy children. So they're highly regulated, unlike many other industries where you're taking pills and doing things that are supposed to like make you feel better.
Vitamin.
Yeah. Well, I forgot what I was going to say there.
It's just that, like, you might have, what I take from is like the flu vaccine, for example, is like, a lot of my friends won't take it because they're like, I took it once and I felt
I
sick
got
for a
sick,
day.
yeah.
But what those people aren't realizing is that then come January, they got a horrible flu and they get really sick and they're not thinking, oh, I didn't, if only I'd gotten my vaccine. Like I've noticed that a lot because I always get my flu vaccine. Some people like in my life, they go in and out of it. And there will be times in January where they'll get sick. And I remind them like, I'm not sick.
That happened to me
hanging
this
out.
year. I think I said it on the pod.
Yeah,
I'm embarrassed to admit it, but when I would normally get my flu vaccine this year, I was traveling for a few months. And I think in my mind, I was like, I'll have to just get it when I get back. And I didn't. And I had like my worst sickness I've had in a long time.
And I was in the house with you and all these things.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is an important thing this is what people need to think about. Because it's so easy to think I got the vaccine and then I felt like kind of weird for 12 hours or I got a little bit of a headache the next day. It's like, okay, but that's like scientifically.
And then I caught the flu and got a little sick, but maybe it's like you might have had it way worse.
Way
Like
worse,
this
or
year,
you gave
for
it to
like
someone.
weeks, I was sick, coughing,
Contagious.
feeling so awful. It was like, and I was so mad at myself. You know, you just like when you go so many years without having to think about it, either because I had the vaccines or just like got lucky by not being exposed certain years. This year was such a reminder for me of like, I can't let that slip my mind again.
Yeah.
And I won't make that mistake again because I got so sick. And of course, that's just one data piece. I'm not trying to like say my experience is for everyone, but based on what you see from research like that, vaccines protect sickness. You might still catch it, but you're probably then in that case going to have less severe symptoms.
So now there have been some researchers, like one study on 8,000 children said that they found that if a mother had a higher exposure to ozone levels, it was associated with increased autism. Okay. So that's like a pollutant that's actually decreasing overall in general in the public. So that doesn't explain the large increase in the recent years, but pollution does have an effect, unlike vaccines, which has zero effect on autism. Let's just like reiterate that. Mm-hmm. Heavy metals, for example, can also have an effect on the babies. Same with, so for example, like the heavy metal would maybe somehow be exposed to the mother, which would make its way into the fetus. But again, heavy metals are also decreasing in the general public, like lead, like all the sort of quote unquote environmental factors that
seemed legitimately
bad are all decreasing in our populations where we're seeing autism increase. So it's just not making sense. Also, it's extremely rare that it causes, autism. It's because it's rare to just get heavy metals in you. Another interesting one was screen time, and they did find some studies that did find kids who were having symptoms or whatever of autism, like maybe having trouble holding eye contact or something like that. After they decreased screen time, they were better at holding eye contact. But all those studies ended up coming with interventions with parents about how to interact with your kid. So they weren't able to differentiate if it was the screen time or actually parents getting help with how to talk and sort of mitigate their kids.
Yeah. And that's an interesting point too. And this is probably true of other kinds of conditions or even, well, maybe not diseases, but where multiple issues can conflate to have similar symptoms, right? So like maybe screen time, like, and obviously this is why like definitions are important and structures from like doctors and health professionals, because like maybe screen time does have an effect on the way someone's brain develops or their social capacity, which may not mean that they're like genetically autistic, you know, like they may not have gotten it from the genetics, but maybe there's like an environmental factor like screen time that has affected their development in terms of their communication. And maybe a scientist or a health professional would say, well, okay, definitionally that still falls into like what we're calling autistic. But like you said, in that case, maybe they're able to work with certain therapies through parent counseling and that sort of stuff to work on that. Whereas there might be genetic cases where it's different. You know what I mean? Like that it's a harder barrier to break through.
Okay, so now we're going to explain to you the real reason why there is an increase in autism, because there is an answer. And then we're going to get into why RFK is denying this and why truly Jr. is evil and completely like everyone needs to be warned about what is happening as we go into this time where there is, I guess, an authoritarian government in America. And we just have to keep talking about that. Okay, so the real reason is due to diagnostics, and the MAGA movement is going to be lying to you about this. And Nature magazine has come out with a whole essentially article constantly trying to explain like, okay, we're under attack by these politicians who are just going to lie to you at this point because there's no, this is the reason.
Okay.
So in the 1960s, in order to be considered autistic, you had to be nonverbal. So then obviously that would be way less people being considered autistic.
Yeah.
In the 1980s, the diagnostics started to include people who were hyperfixated on specific things and who couldn't really rein that in when they were around other people. But also it's important to know that in the 1980s, in order to have autism, you had to be diagnosed as a kid. You were not allowed.
Like
there was no
diagnosis.
adult diagnosis. And then also something kind of funny was like in the article it mentioned, this is when The Rain Man came out. Like in 1988, I think was the movie.
What The Rain Man is.
Oh,
like I know it's a movie, but I've never seen it.
Sorry, it's like someone who's like, the way that he acted was the way that people would have at the time been like, that's someone with autism.
Described an autistic person. Okay.
In the 1990s, there was the minimum number of criteria got higher. So essentially like it was easier to become considered diagnosed with autism. In like 1994, it changed. In 2013, Asperger's was no longer separated from autism. It was looped into ASD. So all of a sudden now even more people are becoming diagnosed with ASD. One study found that from 1980 to 2011, 60% of the increases were all considered due to diagnostic testing.
Okay.
And
So
I think
just simply because more people are being diagnosed with it for all the reasons you've just stated. Doesn't mean like suddenly more people like.
No, it's like if someone has Asperger's, they're now considered there's no such thing as Asperger's. They have ASD.
Yeah.
So now the ASD community has grown. So then to consider what could have been happening since 2011, the general consensus is that it all has to do with an increased awareness of autism, a declining stigma among teachers and the broader public, increased diagnostic testing, and support services. So now as a teacher, you're going to be more vigilant about who might have an ASD because there's more resources for them. There's a way you can talk to the parent and say, and this is what we can do for them to help them. In the past, it would be like, your kid is having problems in school. They're a problematic child. Now it's like, oh, they actually might have ASD. Here are all the positive ways that we can help you. And then on top of that, parents are seeking diagnosis for their kids more often than ever before, because when their kid is being told, when they're being told by a teacher that their kid is having problems, they immediately will go to like the concept of ASD because we're all talking about it. Another thing that the general trend overall is that in the past, it was considered that women and little girls could not have autism, completely overlooked. So now only recently is it become normalized to even consider it for women and little girls, which is just another reason why you're like, science is so fucked sometimes. And then one of the biggest things that they see now is just the ability for adults to then get tested and decide if they have ASD or not. In the past, again, it was only children. And all of that is encompassing what scientists and researchers are calling an epidemic of diagnosis, not an epidemic of autism. Yes. Okay. So one of the most important researchers has decided to try and say it like that because he knows it's being co-opted as an epidemic. It's an epidemic of diagnosis. And okay, so RFK Jr. literally said that the increase in the autism spectrum disorders that they are seeing are severe, which is an absolute lie. The increase in ASD disorders that are causing all the drastic changes in statistics are due to minor versions of it where people still have jobs, they're still working. And then, so RFK Jr. also said, what's the reason we need to figure out why this is happening is because these people, they can't hold a job, they can't pay taxes. That really pissed off the ASD community who was like, that is complete brainwashing of what this actually is and is completely evil. And then on top of that, they're now doing this $50 million prize grant. This is what they're trying to say, funding research to figure out the cause of autism. While simultaneously, since the beginning of 2025, when Trump was elected, they've decreased the actual research on autism and potential treatments and ways to help with it by $62 billion. So again, they're lying. They're just, sorry, that's 62 million. Sorry. They're giving a $50 million grant while completely defunding the research that talks about improving these people's lives and actually dealing with what happens. So they're trying to pave a way. This is what researchers and scientists are scared of, to bring in vaccine hesitancy, to blame it on vaccines.
Because they just want an answer.
Because they want an answer. And RFK Jr. is a liar. He's untrustworthy and he's anti-vax, and he wants to create an anti-vax campaign, and they want to use autism as the reason. So they're trying to create doubt by including decreasing the grants. So many scientists who are studying ASD and how to deal with it in America have now lost their jobs and lost all of their funding, while they've brought in this other source of funding to only look at one aspect of it, which is the cause. And a lot of autistic people are really upset because some autistic people are like, we don't really care what caused this. We want to figure out how we can live our lives better. Why are you focusing on this? It's because they don't actually care about people, which hopefully people are starting to realize. They care about an agenda and an authoritarian look at science. And then there's so much more happening, like the person at the CDC resigning recently after pressure from RFK Jr. to release results about vaccines that were not true. So the science coming from RFK Jr. and the American government is extremely scary. It's completely made up, and it's about an authoritarian regime taking over power in subtle ways. And autism is being used as a scapegoat. And the last thing I'll say is that there's a specific committee called the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, which is supposed to allow people who suffer from ASD to be in these conversations. They have not been consulted at all this year by the Trump administration, have been completely ostracized from any of this discussion. So the reason that we're going to have to keep talking about and have episodes like this is that we are living through a really menacing time where like autism is being used and co-opted to push an anti-vax campaign, which is actually just about building individualistic looks at the world to have an authoritarian regime take over America. It's it's
happening.
wild.
It's happening with much more than just autism too. I think like there's many issues like this that this administration in America and movements around the world,
in Canada and right-wing movements,
but
all
specifically,
over,
obviously, like the U.S. government is such a big force in this world, and the people that are in it using these kind of also like wedge controversial issues to pass kinds of legislation that matter to them for forms of control, who can have access to funding, and all these kinds of things. And it is like super nefarious and scary. The one thing I want to say is like there is a much more interesting conversation around like the age of diagnosis. There's a book I started reading about this that's fascinating, and it's like the question of whether is this overdiagnosis a bad thing? Is it a good thing? Like sometimes when somebody's diagnosed, the book's kind of touching on like there's somebody who didn't know they had this specific issue. I can't remember. It's like a very niche disorder. They only found out when they were older versus somebody who found it when they were younger, and how that can change their lives, right? And like, of course, these are disorders that are on the cusp of how much do they actually affect your life. Like, of course, if you have extreme ASD, and people are going to notice, and you're going to need attention much earlier. But just this idea of like, if I, for example, was, and many people make jokes on this podcast about me like being on the spectrum somewhere, it's like if I actually found out I was, or if you actually found out you have ADHD, how does that change your life, and is it for the better always, right?
Interesting.
And I think there's like interesting conversations around like the world we live in and how people self-diagnose on the internet, and that of course makes them go to their doctor and look for these kinds of things, and their doctors might like give them that test and maybe they have it. So I just think like there are interesting conversations around there, and it's not to say shut that down.
No, of course not. But like, it's just so sad that we can't have it's going to be harder and harder to have nuanced conversations about anything in regards to science when it's being completely attacked, which is the frustrating part about this situation. Okay. I feel like that was honestly like all the information that like is probably necessary for right now. And we will be continuing to have to probably like talk about this. And it's like, I think it's worth saying it's Friday, September 19th when we recorded this, because like
lots of news changes.
Oh my God, I'm just reading
days.
that they're like literally looking into like not giving hepatitis B vaccines and shit. And anyways,
go watch our video on vaccines, by the way.
We
that just came out because it will address their effectiveness.
Yes, and maybe like send it to friends and family. Oh my God, I don't know. We like it's so exhausting to be back in a place where like, oh my God, I just want to talk about fun shit.
I know. Well, our next episode will make like more lighthearted and fun.
Yeah, sure. Let's sleep.
You know, it's nice to go back and forth. Okay, thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening. Send this to people who need to hear it. Bye.
Bye.